Eleanor's life had always been shaped by the kind of loss that leaves a mark on a person's soul. She grew up in the shadow of her family's absence, their memories haunting her more than their presence ever did. The sharp pain of losing them in her formative years pushed her into the world of art, where emotions could be bled onto canvases and tangled brushstrokes could express what words never could. Her life was a quiet one, framed by the solitary comfort of her studio, and though she was successful as a freelance artist, she lived in the quiet corners of the world, often forgotten by those who reveled in wealth and status. Art had kept her grounded, giving her purpose, but love, trust, was something she had long abandoned. She had learned the hard way that to love was to risk heartache, and she wasn't ready to expose herself to that kind of pain again. Yet, in the depths of her loneliness, there was always a hope that someday someone might understand the person beneath the walls. Adrian, on the other hand, was the kind of man who seemed to have everything the world could offer: wealth, success, and a life that others envied. He had worked tirelessly to build his empire, but in doing so, he had lost the ability to connect with anyone on a deeper, more intimate level. His past was littered with failed relationships where love had been a fleeting, shallow thing, something he couldn't grasp and didn't understand. His heart was locked behind the facade of his perfect life, and he had long ago stopped trying to find meaning in the mess of human connections. To him, love was just another obstacle, something that could be bought, something that he didn't need. He was perfectly content with the quiet power of his success, though deep down, he wondered if there was more to life than the cold comfort of his accomplishments. The day they met, Adrian was simply attending an art exhibition, something that seemed a far cry from his usual world of boardrooms and business deals. It was there that he saw her work for the first time. Eleanor's art was raw, unpolished, but full of emotional depth that he couldn't ignore. He stood in front of her paintings, captivated by the story they told, the pain and beauty woven together in ways he had never encountered before. Her work, though messy, resonated with something inside him, something he had long buried under the layers of his success. He didn't know her, yet he felt drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. She was not the kind of woman who would care about his wealth. He knew that much, and perhaps that's what intrigued him the most. She was untouched by the world he lived in, and that seemed like something worth pursuing. Eleanor, however, was far less impressed by the man who stood before her. She had met men like him before, rich, successful, and indifferent to the struggles of those less fortunate. To her, Adrian was just another art collector, another person interested in her work, but not in the artist herself. She learned long ago to protect herself from people who only saw the surface, and Adrian seemed no different. She didn't want to be just another object of interest in a man's collection. But as she watched him studying her paintings, there was something in his gaze that made her pause. It wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper, something that hinted at a vulnerability she hadn't expected. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than the sleek exterior he wore. Their first conversation was brief, but in the exchange, there was a flicker of something neither of them could ignore. Adrian spoke to her not as a collector, but as someone genuinely interested in understanding her art, her passion, her pain. He asked questions that made her think, made her see her own work in new ways. And Eleanor, despite her initial reluctance, found herself intrigued by the man who seemed to look beyond her art and into the heart of who she was. He wasn't trying to impress her, nor was he interested in her work simply because it was valuable. There was a genuine curiosity in his eyes, a kind of raw intellectual admiration that made her wonder if maybe there was something in him worth exploring. Their emotional connection grew slowly, but it was undeniable. What began as an intellectual admiration began to shift into something deeper, more personal. Adrian found himself drawn to the vulnerability in Eleanor's art and in her, the way she bared her soul with every brushstroke, the way she spoke of her past pain with a quiet honesty. He admired her strength, but more than that, he was captivated by her fragility, something he rarely allowed himself to witness in others. He began to see in her something that was missing in his own life, the ability to be emotionally open, to show raw vulnerability, without fear. For someone who had spent most of his life hiding behind his wealth and success, Eleanor was like a breath of fresh air, untouched by the world he knew, but full of depth and complexity. Eleanor, too, began to find herself drawn to Adrian in a way she hadn't anticipated. Despite her reservations, she couldn't help but see the sincerity in his actions, the way he listened to her with an intensity she hadn't experienced before. She had never met a man who didn't try to manipulate her or make her into something she wasn't. Adrian, however, seemed different. He didn't want to change her. He wanted to understand her. And while Eleanor's instincts told her to remain guarded, a small part of her, one she had buried deep inside, was beginning to trust him. Adrian wasn't like the others. He was quiet, patient, and when he spoke, it felt as if he truly saw her, as though he wasn't afraid to look beneath the surface. Their bond began to deepen, slowly at first, until one day, they found themselves spending more time together outside of the art world. Adrian would accompany her to galleries, and she would join him for quiet dinners. Just the two of them, no pretense, no expectations. In these moments, they began to open up to each other in ways that neither had expected. Adrian showed her a side of himself that was soft, unguarded, and caring. He listened to her, not just with his ears but with his heart. And Eleanor, for the first time in a long while, found herself opening up to him, sharing her fears, her dreams, and the pain of her past. She began to see Adrian not as a distant businessman, but as a man who had his own wounds, his own scars, and his own need for connection. But as their bond grew, so did Eleanor's fears. She had been burned by love before, and she wasn't sure she was ready to expose herself to that kind of vulnerability again. Adrian was everything she had once dreamed of, a man who understood her art, her passion, and her need for emotional security. Yet, the deeper she fell for him, the more she feared losing herself in the process. She was torn between the desire to let herself be loved and the fear that, in doing so, she might lose the independence and strength she had fought so hard to build. Love was a dangerous thing, and Eleanor wasn't sure if she could ever truly trust in it again. Adrian arrived to see her in the dress, expecting the tears and joy that usually accompanies such a moment. But instead, when he saw her, he was struck by the hesitation in her eyes, the discomfort in her posture. It was as though the dress had become a barrier between them, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. His heart sank as he saw the pain in her expression, and he realized that despite all his efforts, despite all the grand gestures, he had failed to truly understand her. He had pushed her too far, tried to force her into a mold that wasn't hers to fit. In that moment, the realization hit him hard. He might lose her forever if he didn't find a way to fix what had broken between them. As the wedding ceremony began, Adrian stood at the altar, struggling to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. When Eleanor walked down the aisle, the sight of her took his breath away. She was beautiful, but it wasn't just her appearance that struck him. It was the sadness in her eyes, the unspoken words between them that hung heavy in the air. When they exchanged vows, the look in her eyes, the fear, the sorrow, the uncertainty, was almost too much for him to bear. And as he spoke his vows, the words felt hollow, as though they were only part of the illusion of perfection he had tried so hard to create. When the vows were done, and Adrian saw her in the dress for the first time in its entirety, something inside him broke. The dress, which he had bought with such love and devotion, now symbolized all the things they had failed to communicate, all the expectations they had failed to meet. In that moment, he realized that their love wasn't about perfection. It was about the messiness, the vulnerability, and the willingness to grow together. But it was too late. The weight of everything they had both struggled to hide, his need for control, her fear of vulnerability, was too much to overcome in that moment. As the ceremony continued, Adrian felt a deep sense of loss, not just for the wedding that wasn't, but for the love they had both let slip through their fingers. Unable to keep it together any longer, Adrian broke down in front of their guests, overwhelmed by the realization that the perfect love he had tried to build was not the love Eleanor needed. The ceremony, meant to be the pinnacle of their journey together, became a painful turning point. A moment of truth where both of them realized they had been trying to live up to an ideal that didn't exist. And in that realization, they both found themselves standing at the edge of a future that felt uncertain. Their love no longer the fairy tale they had hoped for, but something deeper and more real. Born from the rawness of their emotions and their willingness to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. Eleanor had never imagined herself in a place like this. The bridal boutique was nothing short of a dream. A world of pristine white marble floors, gleaming chandeliers that reflected off polished mirrors, and shelves lined with gowns that could make any woman feel like royalty. But for Eleanor, everything about it felt alien. She had spent most of her life moving from one small apartment to the next, painting and scraping by. This extravagant world, filled with plush velvet chairs and the scent of luxury in the air, made her feel like an imposter. The boutique staff, all smiles and eager to help, only seemed to magnify her discomfort, their warmth accentuating her growing sense of inadequacy. Adrian, however, appeared unfazed by it all. He stood beside her, looking perfectly at home in the glimmering environment, as if he belonged in this world, in a way she never could. His reassurances that she deserved this experience did little to calm her nerves. In fact, they only deepened her unease, making her feel even more disconnected from the reality she had known. As they made their way through the boutique, Eleanor couldn't help but examine herself in the large mirrors. She wasn't sure who this woman was that stared back at her, draped in fabric she couldn't afford and surrounded by people who seemed to view her as something extraordinary. She felt too small for this, too ordinary. She had come from a life of hardship, of loss, and of learning to fend for herself. She didn't belong in this world, and the longer she stood there, the more painfully apparent that truth became. Adrian's insistence that she deserved the best seemed like an echo in her mind, drowning out her self-doubt, but it couldn't quiet the feeling that she wasn't worthy of it of him. The more lavish the experience, the more she felt like she was being suffocated by expectations. She had always been comfortable with the simplicity of her life, of her art, of the love she gave so freely to those few who had earned it. But now, in the midst of opulence, she felt as if she were suffocating under the weight of what was expected of her. Then she tried on the first gown, a beautiful creation of silk and lace, designed to fit her body like a second skin. It was stunning, but the longer she stood in front of the mirror, the more her discomfort grew. The dress was beautiful, but it was as if it was not really hers. It made her feel exposed, as though she had stepped into a role she wasn't prepared for. Adrian's face lit up as he saw her in the gown, his admiration obvious in the way his eyes drank in every detail. But the look only unsettled her more. The dress seemed to transform her, but it did so in a way that felt wrong, as if she were no longer Eleanor but a version of herself that was too polished, too perfect. She wondered if Adrian saw her for who she truly was, or if he was just seeing an image, an ideal bride that existed only in the luxury of the moment. The gown, so exquisite and so far removed from the life she had once known, felt like a mask, and as she gazed at herself in the mirror, she felt a growing chasm between the woman she was and the woman she was expected to become. Eleanor's mind was spinning as she stepped out of the dressing room and stood before Adrian, trying to keep her anxiety at bay. He was enchanted by her, as if she were the epitome of grace, but she couldn't escape the feeling that he was no longer seeing her, just the illusion of her. The woman in the dress, the woman he admired, wasn't her. She wasn't sure she could be that woman, or even wanted to be. As Adrian gushed over how beautiful she looked, Eleanor's discomfort grew until it became unbearable. She had always been hesitant about love, but now, in the quiet moments between Adrian's praises, she felt the weight of his expectations pressing down on her. She didn't want to be admired for something she wasn't. She didn't want to be someone's idea perfect. She was already struggling to reconcile the love she had for Adrian with her own fears. But now, in the light of his admiration, she questioned if their love could ever be real. Was he falling in love with her? Or was he falling in love with the idea of her, the woman who fit the role he had created for her? Adrian arrived to see her in the dress, expecting the tears and joy that usually accompanies such a moment. But instead, when he saw her, he was struck by the hesitation in her eyes, the discomfort in her posture. It was as though the dress had become a barrier between them, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. His heart sank as he saw the pain in her expression, and he realized that despite all his efforts, despite all the grand gestures, he had failed to truly understand her. He had pushed her too far, tried to force her into a mold that wasn't hers to fit. In that moment, the realization hit him hard. He might lose her forever if he didn't find a way to fix what had broken between them. As the wedding ceremony began, Adrian stood at the altar, struggling to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. When Eleanor walked down the aisle, the sight of her took his breath away. She was beautiful, but it wasn't just her appearance that struck him. It was the sadness in her eyes, the unspoken words between them that hung heavy in the air. When they exchanged vows, the look in her eyes, the fear, the sorrow, the uncertainty, was almost too much for him to bear. And as he spoke his vows, the words felt hollow, as though they were only part of the illusion of perfection he had tried so hard to create. When the vows were done, and Adrian saw her in the dress for the first time in its entirety, something inside him broke. The dress, which he had bought with such love and devotion, now symbolized all the things they had failed to communicate, all the expectations they had failed to meet. In that moment, he realized that their love wasn't about perfection. It was about the messiness, the vulnerability, and the willingness to grow together. But it was too late. The weight of everything they had both struggled to hide, his need for control, her fear of vulnerability, was too much to overcome in that moment. As the ceremony continued, Adrian felt a deep sense of loss, not just for the wedding that wasn't, but for the love they had both let slip through their fingers. Unable to keep it together any longer, Adrian broke down in front of their guests, overwhelmed by the realization that the perfect love he had tried to build was not the love Eleanor needed. The ceremony, meant to be the pinnacle of their journey together, became a painful turning point, a moment of truth where both of them realized they had been trying to live up to an ideal that didn't exist. And in that realization, they both found themselves standing at the edge of a future that felt uncertain. Their love no longer the fairy tale they had hoped for, but something deeper and more real. Born from the rawness of their emotions and their willingness to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. Eleanor had never imagined herself in a place like this. The bridal boutique was nothing short of a dream. A world of pristine white marble floors, gleaming chandeliers that reflected off polished mirrors, and shelves lined with gowns that could make any woman feel like royalty. But for Eleanor, everything about it felt alien. She had spent most of her life moving from one small apartment to the next, painting and scraping by. This extravagant world, filled with plush velvet chairs and the scent of luxury in the air, made her feel like an imposter. The boutique staff, all smiles and eager to help, only seemed to magnify her discomfort, their warmth accentuating her growing sense of inadequacy. Adrian, however, appeared unfazed by it all. He stood beside her, looking perfectly at home in the glimmering environment, as if he belonged in this world, in a way she never could. His reassurances that she deserved this experience did little to calm her nerves. In fact, they only deepened her unease, making her feel even more disconnected from the reality she had known. As they made their way through the boutique, Eleanor couldn't help but examine herself in the large mirrors. She wasn't sure who this woman was that stared back at her. Draped in fabric she couldn't afford and surrounded by people who seemed to view her as something extraordinary. She felt too small for this, too ordinary. She had come from a life of hardship, of loss, and of learning to fend for herself. She didn't belong in this world, and the longer she stood there, the more painfully apparent that truth became. Adrian's insistence that she deserved the best seemed like an echo in her mind, drowning out her self-doubt, but it couldn't quiet the feeling that she wasn't worthy of it of him. The more lavish the experience, the more she felt like she was being suffocated by expectations. She had always been comfortable with the simplicity of her life, of her art, of the love she gave so freely to those few who had earned it. But now, in the midst of opulence. She felt as if she were suffocating under the weight of what was expected of her. Then she tried on the first gown, a beautiful creation of silk and lace, designed to fit her body like a second skin. It was stunning, but the longer she stood in front of the mirror, the more her discomfort grew. The dress was beautiful, but it was as if it was not really hers. It made her feel exposed, as though she had stepped into a role she wasn't prepared for. Adrian's face lit up as he saw her in the gown, his admiration obvious in the way his eyes drank in every detail. But the look only unsettled her more. The dress seemed to transform her, but it did so in a way that felt wrong, as if she were no longer Eleanor but a version of herself that was too polished, too perfect. She wondered if Adrian saw her for who she truly was, or if he was just seeing an image, an ideal bride that existed only in the luxury of the moment. The gown, so exquisite and so far removed from the life she had once known, felt like a mask, and as she gazed at herself in the mirror, she felt a growing chasm between the woman she was and the woman she was expected to become. Eleanor's mind was spinning as she stepped out of the dressing room and stood before Adrian, trying to keep her anxiety at bay. He was enchanted by her, as if she were the epitome of grace, but she couldn't escape the feeling that he was no longer seeing her, just the illusion of her. The woman in the dress, the woman he admired, wasn't her. She wasn't sure she could be that woman, or even wanted to be. As Adrian gushed over how beautiful she looked, Eleanor's discomfort grew until it became unbearable. She had always been hesitant about love, but now, in the quiet moments between Adrian's praises, she felt the weight of his expectations pressing down on her. She didn't want to be admired for something she wasn't. She didn't want to be someone's idea of perfect. She was already struggling to reconcile the love she had for Adrian with her own fears. But now, in the light of his admiration, she questioned if their love could ever be real. Was he falling in love with her? Or was he falling in love with the idea of her, the woman who fit the role he had created for her? With every passing moment, Eleanor found herself questioning what was real in her relationship with Adrian. Was he seeing the real her, the woman who had spent years hiding her vulnerability, the artist who poured her heart into her work? Or was he enamored by the surface, the polished version of herself she was becoming? The gown, which should have been a celebration of their love, instead became a symbol of her growing unease. The dress no longer felt like a beautiful garment meant to mark a special occasion, but a burden, an expectation she wasn't sure she could bear. It represented everything that Adrian seemed to want her to be, and as the wedding day drew closer, the idea of stepping into that future felt more and more impossible. Would she be able to let go of her doubts and embrace the life that Adrian wanted to build for them, or would she be swallowed whole by the role she was being asked to play? The closer the wedding day came, the more Eleanor's doubts festered. She couldn't help but look back at her past, at the failed relationships that had left her with scars deeper than any dress could cover. Each disappointment had made her more cautious, more guarded. She had always feared that love would demand more than she could give, that it would take pieces of her that she would never get back. And now, standing in front of Adrian, dressed in the perfect gown, she feared that history was repeating itself. She feared that if she gave into this fantasy, the life he was offering her, she would lose herself in the process. Adrian had given her everything she had ever dreamed of, but could she truly trust him? Could she trust herself? Adrian, for his part, noticed the distance growing between them. It had always been there, but now it felt more pronounced, more obvious. He watched as Eleanor's smile began to fade, as the joy she once seemed to have in his presence started to slip away. When they spoke of their future together, it felt like they were speaking different languages. He thought he was giving her everything: luxury, security, a future without worry. But with each grand gesture, he began to sense that he was pushing her further away. His own fears began to take root. Was he losing her? Would she ever be able to see past the wealth, past the life he had built, and love him for who he truly was? Or was he just another man in a long line of broken hearts? Someone else who had failed to understand her needs? His anxiety mounted with each passing day. The wedding was supposed to be a celebration, but all he could see was a growing gap between them. As the wedding day approached, neither of them felt ready. Adrian's need to control the situation, to make everything perfect, began to clash with the vulnerability that true intimacy required. Eleanor, on the other hand, found herself questioning everything: her love for Adrian, her place in his world, and the life she was about to step into. She wondered if she was ready to be the woman he wanted her to be, or if the pressure of those expectations would drown her. Their emotional distance grew, and the closer they got to the altar, the more it seemed like the wedding wouldn't be the culmination of their love, but a final step toward the unraveling of everything they had built. As the days leading up to the wedding drew nearer, Eleanor could no longer push aside the doubts that clouded her mind. The dress, which once seemed like a beautiful symbol of the life she could share with Adrian, now weighed heavily on her soul. She spent more and more time alone, wandering through the empty spaces of her thoughts, wondering if she was ready to take the next step. The fear of being swallowed by the expectations that had begun to suffocate her was almost unbearable. Each time she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, draped in the bridal gown, she felt like a stranger, as though the woman in the reflection was someone she didn't recognize, someone she didn't know how to become. Eleanor's inner turmoil reached a boiling point the night before the wedding. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to step into a role she wasn't ready to play. Her past, the heartbreaks, and the scars left by her family's abandonment all seemed to rise to the surface, swirling around her in a dark cloud of fear. She had never been able to let go of the pain that clung to her, the pain that made her cautious about trusting anyone, especially someone like Adrian. He offered her everything she had ever dreamed of, but in return, it felt like she was expected to give up pieces of herself she wasn't sure she could live without. The future they seemed to be building together felt more like a cage than a promise of love. Meanwhile, Adrian could feel the distance between them growing more palpable with each passing moment. He tried to reassure her, tried to ease her fears with gentle words and small gestures of affection, but nothing seemed to break through the walls she had begun to build around herself. His own anxiety was spiraling, unsure of how to fix the distance that had grown between them. He had thought that the wedding would be the culmination of everything they had worked toward, the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, but instead it felt like the end of something they had never fully understood. His desire to make everything perfect was starting to backfire. The pressure he placed on himself to give her everything she deserved only seemed to push her further away. He had built this perfect life for them, but was it what she wanted, or was it something that would drive her to break? As the night wore on, Eleanor lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, overwhelmed by the growing fear that she was about to make a decision she would regret. She couldn't ignore the truth any longer, the truth that love, as much as she wanted it, felt suffocating, a force that could take her in and consume her. She had loved Adrian with everything she had, but love, to her, had always been a place of vulnerability, a place where you gave so much of yourself that you ended up losing your sense of self in return. She wasn't sure she could take that risk again, even if Adrian was the man who had done everything in his power to show her that he was different. At the same time, Adrian lay in his own bed, staring at the darkened ceiling, his mind racing with the same questions that plagued Eleanor. He knew he had done everything in his power to create the perfect life for them, but now he questioned whether that had been the right approach. Had he pushed too hard? Had his need to protect her, to offer her a life that seemed too perfect, led her to question everything they had together? In his desperation to show her how much he loved her, had he missed the subtle signs that she was slipping away? The fear of losing her consumed him, and yet he didn't know how to bridge the gap that had formed between them. The day of the wedding arrived with the usual frenzy of preparations. The air was thick with the weight of expectation, and the sound of heels clicking on the marble floors and the rustling of satin dresses only added to the growing tension. Eleanor stood before the mirror, dressed in the gown that had once seemed like a symbol of their love, but now felt like a shackle. She looked at herself, trying to reconcile the woman she had become with the woman she wanted to be. She wanted to be strong, independent, and true to herself, but as she looked at the face in the mirror, she couldn't help but feel the pressure of all the expectations weighing her down. She was about to marry a man who loved her more than she thought she deserved. But was she ready to fully embrace the life he wanted to build for them? Was she ready to become the woman she was expected to be? In the meantime, Adrian stood at the altar, nervously waiting for Eleanor to walk down the aisle. He couldn't see her face yet, but he could feel the tension in the air. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know how to fix it. As the door opened and the music played, he turned to see Eleanor standing there, breathtaking in the gown that he had chosen for her. She was perfect, but the look on her face told a different story. There was no joy, no excitement, only uncertainty. His heart sank as he watched her take tentative steps down the aisle, unsure whether she was walking toward him or toward something else entirely. Eleanor's heart raced as she made her way toward the altar. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the decision she was about to make was pushing her down with every movement. She had never felt so lost, so uncertain about her future. Adrian was standing there, waiting for her, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to take this final step. She couldn't deny the love she felt for him, but she also couldn't ignore the growing fear that she was about to lose herself in the process. The aisle between them felt impossibly long, a symbol of the emotional distance that had grown between them over the past few days. She wasn't sure if she was walking toward a new beginning, or if she was about to step into a life that would consume her. Adrian watched as Eleanor approached, his heart in his throat. He wanted to reach out, to take her hand and reassure her, but he knew that now, more than ever, she needed to make this decision on her own. He couldn't protect her from everything, not even from the fears that had taken root deep inside her. As she reached the altar, he saw the tear in her eyes, the same tear he had been afraid of seeing. It was a tear of doubt, of uncertainty, and it made him question everything. Was he really the man she wanted to marry, or was he just another in a long line of disappointments? Was this the end or the beginning of something they could rebuild? The moment stretched on, frozen in time, as the two of them stood there, facing each other, but unable to bridge the distance that had grown between them. Neither of them knew what the future held, but one thing was certain. Their love was no longer just about the perfect wedding, the perfect dress, or the perfect life. It was about something deeper, something more fragile. And for the first time, both of them realized that love, in all its beauty and pain, was never going to be perfect. It would always require sacrifice, vulnerability, and above all, the willingness to face the unknown together. Eleanor woke up with a heavy heart, the weight of the morning pressing on her chest like a vice. The soft golden light of the sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room, but it did little to ease the storm brewing inside her. Her thoughts were a whirlpool of doubt and fear. How could she be so uncertain on the day that was supposed to be the happiest of her life? She loved Adrian. There was no doubt about that. But the reality of what she was about to do was overwhelming. The life she had once known, simple and independent, seemed like a distant memory. She was about to leave behind the version of herself that felt real, that felt safe, and step into a role she wasn't sure she was ready for. The dress, the wedding, the expectations, it all felt like a straitjacket. Would she lose herself in this life with Adrian, this life of wealth and perfection? Or could she still hold on to who she was, despite everything? Adrian, on the other hand, was preparing for the wedding with an uneasy heart. He went through the motions of getting dressed and making small talk, but the nagging feeling of something being wrong never left him. His thoughts kept circling back to Eleanor. Was she truly ready for this? Was the wedding more about him and his need for perfection than about her happiness? The guilt of pushing her into this world, a world she hadn't asked for, gnawed at him. He had envisioned the day so differently. The perfect dress, the perfect venue, the perfect love. But now, as he dressed in his tuxedo, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake. He had worked so hard to create this flawless future for them, but had he overlooked the emotional needs that should have been prioritized instead of the outward perfection? The pressure weighed heavily on his shoulders, knowing that Eleanor was struggling to fit into a life she had never imagined for herself. The moment Eleanor stepped into the wedding dress, it felt as though the world shifted beneath her. As she gazed at her reflection in the mirror, she didn't see the woman she had always been. The gown, once a symbol of commitment, now felt like an anchor, pulling her down into an identity she wasn't sure she could embrace. The person she saw in the mirror was beautiful, no doubt, but she wasn't sure she recognized her anymore. The woman in the dress was poised, elegant, someone who seemed destined for a life of luxury, but she wasn't the same woman who had fallen in love with Adrian. She felt like a stranger, someone who had been carefully crafted for a world that didn't feel like hers. The weight of the fabric, the layers of satin and lace, felt not just on her body, but on her soul. It was more than a dress. It was a symbol of everything she feared about the future. She was losing herself. And the more she looked at herself in the mirror, the more the reality of it sank in. The dress was supposed to represent love and commitment, but to her, it felt like a cage. Adrian, eager to see Eleanor in the dress, entered the room expecting to be swept away by the sight of his bride. But what he saw wasn't the joy he had anticipated. Eleanor stood there, her expression conflicted, her eyes filled with hesitation and unease. He had expected her to light up with happiness, but instead, she seemed distant, withdrawn. The dress, so perfectly tailored, didn't seem to fit her in the way he imagined. There was a disconnect between the woman he had fallen in love with and the woman standing before him in the wedding gown. Adrian's heart sank as he saw the discomfort in her eyes, and he was torn between wanting to comfort her and feeling frustrated at his own inability to ease her fears. He had thought that this day, this wedding, would bring them closer, but instead, it felt as though they were miles apart. The doubts he had been trying to ignore rushed back, and for the first time, he wondered if they had made a mistake. Could he truly give her the life she wanted, or had he simply built a world around her that didn't fit who she was? As the wedding ceremony began, Eleanor's mind raced. Every step down the aisle felt heavier than the last. The eyes of their guests were upon her, but it was Adrian she was searching for. When their gazes met, there was an unspoken understanding between them. He saw the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty that had taken root in her heart. She saw the sadness in his realization that the wedding he had envisioned was nothing like the one unfolding before him. In that fleeting moment, they both knew that this wasn't the fairy tale they had hoped for. The beauty of the ceremony, the elegance of the dress, the carefully crafted vows, it all seemed hollow now. Their love was still there, but it was tangled in the mess of expectations and unspoken fears, and neither of them knew how to untangle it. The aisle between them felt longer than it had ever been, and with each step, Eleanor wondered if she was walking toward the future she had always dreamed of, or toward a life that would suffocate her. The vows were exchanged, but the words felt like a fragile promise rather than a declaration of certainty. Eleanor's voice trembled as she spoke her vows, and Adrian's were filled with sincerity, but they both knew that something had shifted. The hands that exchanged the rings were shaking, not from excitement, but from the weight of everything unsaid. In that moment, both of them understood that the vows they were making were not just to each other, but to the pain they had been carrying. They were promising to try, to hold on, but neither of them was sure if they could make it work. The exchange of rings, a symbol of eternal love, now felt like a contract neither of them was truly ready to sign. It was a bittersweet declaration, laced with sorrow, as both of them wrestled with the fear that their love was not enough to overcome the emotional chasm that had formed between them. When Adrian saw Eleanor in her full wedding gown for the first time, he was struck by the gut-wrenching realization that the dress, which was meant to be a symbol of his devotion, had become something else entirely. It no longer represented the idealized version of their future. It was a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. The perfect wedding, the perfect dress, the life they had tried to build. It was all a fragile illusion. Adrian's internal turmoil reached its breaking point as he realized that the vision he had held for their future was no longer something they could both embrace. The gown, once a symbol of love and commitment, now represented all the ways they had failed to communicate, all the ways they had missed the mark. It was a painful truth, one that neither of them had been willing to face until now. Adrian couldn't hold back his emotions any longer. As the ceremony continued, the reality of the situation hit him like a tidal wave. The perfect wedding he had envisioned, the flawless day, was slipping through his fingers. His perfect bride wasn't standing before him. She was a woman torn between love and fear, between a future that promised everything and one that felt like a prison. As the vows were exchanged and the rings placed on their fingers, Adrian's mask of control cracked. The tears he had kept hidden for so long began to flow freely, his facade of perfection crumbling under the weight of everything he had tried to force into place. The perfect life, the perfect love, it wasn't working. It never had. He was left standing there, exposed, raw, and uncertain, just as Eleanor was. His breakdown was not just about the wedding. It was the culmination of all the mistakes, misunderstandings, and unspoken words between them. He had tried to give her everything he thought she wanted, but in doing so, he had lost sight of what she truly needed. Eleanor, standing at the altar, couldn't look away from Adrian's tears. It was as though everything that had been building up between them came crashing to the surface at once. She had always seen Adrian as a man of strength, of control, someone who could fix everything. But now, in the face of their wedding day, he was broken, just as she was. His vulnerability was a mirror to her own. The weight of the gown, the grand wedding, the expectations, all of it felt suffocating now. She had tried so hard to be the woman he wanted her to be, but she wasn't sure she could keep up the illusion. Adrian's breakdown mirrored her own inner turmoil, and as she watched him crumble, her own walls began to crack. She loved him, she truly did, but what had they built? Was it love? Or was it just a series of carefully orchestrated moments, crafted to look perfect to the outside world? The dress that was supposed to represent their commitment now felt like a symbol of everything that was falling apart between them. The reality of their relationship was too complicated to ignore anymore. The guests, once silent and reverent, began to stir, unsure of how to respond to the raw emotions that were now so apparent. Eleanor could hear the muffled sobs from the crowd, but all she could focus on was Adrian, his tears, his pain, and her own fear of losing herself in this relationship. She stood frozen, trapped between love and fear, unsure of what to do next. The weight of the gown felt unbearable, as if it were physically pulling her down into a future she wasn't sure she was ready for. This wasn't the wedding she had dreamed of. This wasn't the beginning of a beautiful life with Adrian. This was a moment of truth, a moment where both of them were forced to confront the cracks in their relationship that had been ignored for so long. Adrian, finally pulling himself together, looked at Eleanor with eyes full of regret and sorrow. The man he had tried so hard to be, the man who could provide her with everything, was no longer there. He wasn't sure who he was anymore, and he wasn't sure who she was either. They had been so focused on creating the perfect life that they had forgotten to nurture the real connection that had brought them together. The wedding was supposed to be a celebration of their love, but now it felt like a hollow performance. They were both acting out roles that they hadn't fully understood until now. He saw Eleanor, standing before him in the dress, and realized that the gown had become a mask for both of them. She was trying to be someone she wasn't, and he was trying to live up to an ideal he couldn't reach. Their love had been real, but the life they had created around it was a lie. The vows, once a promise of forever, now felt like an admission of failure. Neither of them could speak with the certainty they had hoped for. They were both too afraid of what the future held, too afraid of the person they had become in the pursuit of perfection. The rings, once symbols of commitment, now felt like chains, binding them to a life that neither of them wanted. Eleanor's voice trembled as she said the words, but they didn't feel like vows anymore. They felt like a last attempt to hold on to something that was already slipping away. Adrian's words were filled with sincerity, but they were tinged with doubt. What were they promising? Could they truly make this work? Or were they simply going through the motions, hoping that the love they once shared could carry them through the storm they had created? When the ceremony ended, the reception began, but neither of them was in a celebratory mood. The guests, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, were unsure of how to respond. The joy of the day had been replaced with a palpable sadness that hung in the air. Adrian and Eleanor were supposed to be the picture of happiness, the perfect couple embarking on a beautiful journey together. But instead, they were two people standing on the edge of something they weren't sure they could handle. The dress, once a symbol of love, now felt like a weight that neither of them could escape. It wasn't just the dress. It was the life they had tried to build, the expectations they had placed on each other, and the love that was being tested in ways neither of them had anticipated. Adrian, unable to escape the feeling of emptiness that had settled in his chest, watched as Eleanor moved through the crowd. She seemed distant, her smile forced, her eyes not meeting his. He wanted to pull her close, to make everything right, but he wasn't sure how. The connection they had once shared felt like a distant memory, something he wasn't sure how to reach for anymore. He had tried so hard to create the perfect life for them, but in doing so, he had overlooked what really mattered. The emotional intimacy, the trust, and the understanding that was supposed to underpin their relationship. Now, as they stood together in the midst of their wedding reception, all he could feel was the distance between them. The perfect wedding, the perfect dress, the perfect life. It all felt like a cruel joke. Eleanor, too, felt the gulf between them. She had tried so hard to be the woman Adrian wanted her to be, to fit into the world he had created for them, but the harder she tried, the more she lost herself. The dress, the wedding, the expectations. It all felt like an impossible standard that she could never live up to. Adrian's love for her was real, but was it enough to sustain them through the weight of everything that had been left unsaid? Could they truly navigate the life they had chosen, or were they doomed to remain trapped in a fantasy that neither of them had truly embraced? The questions lingered in her mind as she moved through the crowd, her smile more for the guests than for herself. As the night wore on, both Adrian and Eleanor were left to confront the painful truth that their wedding day had been anything but perfect. The dress, the vows, the promises. They had all been part of a story they had tried to write. But the reality was much more complicated. They were not the perfect couple, and their love was not the perfect fairy tale. They were two people, flawed and uncertain, trying to make sense of a future that was slipping further away with every passing moment. The night stretched on, a blur of fleeting moments and empty gestures. The guests mingled, oblivious to the cracks that had begun to form in the foundation of the newlywed couple's world. Adrian and Eleanor exchanged pleasantries, but the weight of their shared turmoil hung heavily between them. The laughter and chatter around them felt distant, almost foreign, as they moved through the motions of what was supposed to be a joyous celebration. But every time their eyes met, there was no spark, no excitement, only an understanding that neither of them was where they had imagined they would be on this day. Adrian couldn't stop his mind from racing. He had spent so much time focused on the outward perfection of their life, on creating the ideal marriage, that he hadn't realized how much he had neglected the emotional depth that was necessary for it to truly work. All the wealth, the grandeur, the wedding, none of it mattered if they couldn't connect on a deeper level. His need to control everything had pushed Eleanor further away. And now, with the night unfolding in a way neither of them had anticipated, he realized the consequences of his actions. He had become so focused on fixing everything that he hadn't seen the growing divide between them. His love for her was real, but it was wrapped in layers of pressure, expectation, and guilt. And now, standing before him, was the woman he loved, but she was a stranger, distant and guarded, unable or unwilling to open up. Eleanor felt the same. She tried to smile, to act as though everything was fine, but it felt like she was playing a role she wasn't ready for. She had never imagined that her wedding day would feel like this, a day full of regret and fear. The dress, which had once been a symbol of love and commitment, now felt like an anchor, pulling her deeper into a life she wasn't sure she could handle. Adrian's love was evident in everything he did, but his expectations were suffocating her. She had tried to be the perfect wife, to live up to the image of the woman he desired, but in doing so, she had lost herself. Her heart ached as she looked at him, seeing the same confusion and uncertainty reflected in his eyes. They both wanted to be happy, but they didn't know how to get there. They were drowning in their own unmet expectations, unable to communicate what they truly needed from each other. The night wore on, and the moment that should have marked the beginning of their new life together instead felt like the ending of something they hadn't fully understood. Eleanor found herself alone for a few moments, standing off to the side, watching the couples around her dance, laugh, and enjoy the evening. She felt like an outsider, disconnected from the celebration. The life she had known, the simplicity she had cherished, seemed like a distant memory. She had been so focused on Adrian's world, on fitting into the life he had built, that she had lost sight of who she was. And now, with the weight of the dress still heavy on her shoulders, she realized that she didn't know how to find her way back to herself. The world Adrian had given her, beautiful, extravagant, and filled with promise, had become a world she didn't know how to navigate. She was no longer just Eleanor, the artist, the woman who had once lived simply and authentically. She was now someone else, someone trying to fit into a mold that didn't feel like hers. Adrian, too, found himself alone for a moment, standing at the edge of the room. He watched Eleanor from afar, his heart heavy with regret. He had wanted to give her everything, love, security, a future filled with promise. But in doing so, he had forgotten to give her the one thing she needed most: space to be herself. He had tried to make their life together perfect, but in doing so, he had created a life that didn't belong to either of them. He loved her, but he wasn't sure anymore if that love was enough to overcome the weight of all they had ignored. The pressure of expectations, the grandeur of the wedding, and the lifestyle he had introduced her to, it had all taken its toll. He had wanted to protect her from the pain of her past, but in doing so, he had unknowingly built walls between them. As the evening drew to a close, Adrian found himself standing in front of Eleanor, unsure of what to say. The guests had begun to leave. The music had slowed, and the once vibrant celebration had faded into a quiet, somber atmosphere. He took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts, but his words faltered. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes tired, and for the first time, she saw him as he truly was, vulnerable, unsure, and just as lost as she was. She had always seen him as the strong, confident businessman, but tonight, he was just a man who loved her and didn't know how to make things right. "I don't know what's happening between us, Eleanor," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought this was the right thing to do. I thought we were ready. But now I'm not sure." His words were filled with pain, and Eleanor's heart ached as she saw the raw honesty in his eyes. She had never seen him like this before, unfiltered, uncertain, and vulnerable. It scared her, but it also made her feel less alone. Eleanor took a deep breath, her own emotions threatening to overtake her. She had been carrying so much for so long: the fear of love, the fear of losing herself, the fear of being trapped. And now, with Adrian standing before her, she realized that she wasn't the only one afraid. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can be the woman you want me to be. I've lost myself in trying to be someone I'm not." Adrian stepped closer to her, his hand gently reaching for hers. "I never wanted you to change, Eleanor," he said softly. "I just wanted to be with you. But I see now. I see that I've pushed you too far. I wanted to make everything perfect, but I've forgotten what really matters." His words, though simple, held a weight that both of them understood. They had been so focused on the idea of perfection, of a life that looked good on paper, that they had neglected to build the emotional foundation that a real relationship needed. The love was still there, but it was buried beneath layers of fear and doubt. While Eleanor wrestled with these internal battles, she found solace in her art. It had always been a source of expression and release for her, but in the whirlwind of the wedding preparations, she had neglected her creative outlet. Now, it became her refuge. Painting, sketching, and creating once again allowed her to reconnect with herself. It was a reminder of who she was before she met Adrian, before she became wrapped up in the idea of being his perfect partner. Through her art, Eleanor rediscovered her independence, her voice, and her passion. It was a form of healing, a way for her to reconnect with the woman she had almost lost. As she dove back into her creative projects, she began to trust her instincts again, to rediscover her own desires and dreams that had been overshadowed by the weight of her marriage. It was through her art that she began to reclaim her identity. Adrian, in his own way, sought healing. He stepped away from the demanding world of his business, taking time to reflect on the true nature of love and relationships. He realized that he had spent so much of his life striving for success, believing that money, control, and perfection were the keys to happiness. But now, with the lessons he had learned from his marriage, he understood that love was not something that could be manipulated. It wasn't something that could be bought. Real love required vulnerability, emotional connection, and mutual respect. Adrian began to tear down the walls he had built around himself, working through his own emotional immaturity and trying to understand what he truly needed from a relationship. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel his emotions fully, to grieve, to regret, and to hope. As time passed, both Adrian and Eleanor began to feel a tentative hope stirring within them. They were on separate journeys of self-discovery and healing, but there was a quiet shift in their emotional states. Each of them had begun to understand that in order to move forward, they first had to understand themselves. They had spent so much time focusing on each other's needs that they had forgotten to take care of their own. But now, as they worked through their individual struggles, they began to recognize the value of self-love. They knew that before they could offer their love to each other, they first had to be whole on their own. The question remained, could their love be redeemed? Could they rebuild what had been lost? Or was the damage done beyond repair? Eleanor had grown more independent, more confident in herself and her art. Adrian had become more emotionally aware, more willing to embrace vulnerability. But whether their paths would converge again was uncertain. They stood at a crossroads, each facing their own fears and hopes, unsure of whether their love story had a future or if they had reached the end of their journey together. The possibility of redemption lingered in the air, and as they both walked their separate paths, there was a faint sense of hope, a sense that perhaps, if they were willing to let go of the past and embrace the uncertainty of the future, there could be a new beginning waiting for them. The reception began with an uncomfortable silence that hung heavily in the air, a stark contrast to the celebration everyone had anticipated. Adrian and Eleanor moved through the crowd, exchanging obligatory pleasantries with guests, but there was a palpable distance between them that no amount of smiles or polite conversation could hide. Neither of them could break through the facade they had put up, the walls of emotional turmoil that neither knew how to dismantle. Adrian, despite his efforts to maintain a composed demeanor, couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at him. As he looked into Eleanor's eyes, he saw a hollow, detached expression that struck him deeply. Her eyes, once full of warmth and life, now seemed distant, as if she were already slipping away from him. He realized, with a heavy heart, that his obsession with creating the perfect life had inadvertently pushed her further from him, and no grand gesture or lavish reception could undo the rift between them. In the days that followed, both Adrian and Eleanor retreated into their own worlds, the weight of their wedding day lingering like an oppressive cloud. They avoided each other, the silence between them growing more unbearable with each passing hour. Eleanor, isolated and lost in her thoughts, found herself questioning everything. Could she truly be a part of Adrian's world, or had she already lost herself in the process? She began to wonder if this was the price of love, the surrendering of her identity, her independence, her sense of self. Adrian, on the other hand, was consumed by self-blame. He replayed the events of the wedding over and over in his mind, unable to escape the feeling that he had failed her. His need to control every detail of their life had only served to create an emotional distance between them. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized how deeply he had misunderstood what love truly required. Eleanor found herself confronting her deepest fears. She had always been afraid of love, but she now recognized that it wasn't love itself that frightened her. It was the vulnerability it demanded. She had spent so many years protecting herself from the pain of heartbreak that she had built walls around her heart, unwilling to risk the kind of surrender that love required. And now, as she faced the aftermath of their wedding, she wondered if she had ever truly given herself to Adrian, or if she had been holding back all along. The thought of losing herself in someone else, of losing her independence and the identity she had worked so hard to build, was a terrifying prospect. Yet, in the silence of her solitude, she knew that something had to change. Adrian, too, found himself in a moment of reckoning. Away from the public eye, he retreated into solitude, attempting to understand the consequences of his actions. It was only now, in the quiet of his own thoughts, that he began to see the full extent of his mistakes. His desire for perfection, his need to control every aspect of their life, had only pushed Eleanor further away. He had thought that if he could create the perfect life for her, everything would fall into place. But he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered: emotional intimacy. No amount of wealth or grand gestures could replace the vulnerability, the openness, that a true relationship required. In his pursuit of perfection, he had lost sight of what love was supposed to be. It wasn't about control or success. It was about connection, about giving each other the space to be imperfect, to be human. Both Adrian and Eleanor found themselves at a crossroads, standing face to face with truths they had long buried. Adrian's realization was profound. Love couldn't be manipulated or bought. It couldn't be shaped into the perfect image he had envisioned. True connection required emotional openness, and he had been so closed off, so focused on achieving external success, that he had forgotten how to truly connect with the woman he loved. Eleanor, too, faced a painful truth about herself. She had always feared vulnerability, fearing that in letting someone in, she would lose herself. But now, she understood that her reluctance to trust, her fear of surrendering, had kept her from embracing love fully. She had been unwilling to make the sacrifice that love required, to give herself completely, to trust in another without reservation. They stood in silence for a long moment, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The wedding, the dress, the vows. They had all been part of a story they had tried to tell, but now the truth was clear. They had built a life on an illusion, and now they had to figure out how to rebuild it from the ground up. Neither of them knew what the future held. But for the first time that night, they both felt the possibility of something real, something grounded in love, vulnerability, and truth. As the last guest left, Adrian and Eleanor remained standing there, not as a perfect couple, but as two people willing to face the uncertainty of their future together. The dress, once a symbol of everything they had tried to be, now felt like a symbol of their willingness to start anew, imperfect, uncertain, but real. They didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, they were ready to ask the hard questions. They had a long road ahead of them, but they would walk it together, no longer pretending to be something they weren't. The reception carried on, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. The one celebratory atmosphere now felt strained, heavy with unspoken words and uncomfortable glances. Adrian and Eleanor moved through the crowd, each playing their part, but neither of them could mask the deep emotional rift that had formed between them. Their smiles were forced, their conversations stilted, and the energy that had once fueled their love now seemed like an illusion. Guests could sense the tension, the absence of the joy that was meant to radiate from the newlywed couple. There was a palpable disconnect, but neither Adrian nor Eleanor was willing or able to address it. Adrian watched Eleanor from across the room, her eyes distant, detached. It was as though she was no longer there with him, lost in some other world he couldn't reach. The guilt washed over him in waves. He had tried so hard to create the perfect life for her, to make everything flawless, but in the process, he had lost sight of the one thing that mattered: her heart. He could see the hollow look in her eyes, and it devastated him. The realization that his need for perfection had driven a wedge between them hit him with full force. No matter how much wealth or grandeur he provided, it could never fill the emptiness that had now taken root in their relationship. In the days that followed, Adrian and Eleanor retreated into their separate worlds, each of them trying to make sense of the emotional fallout from their wedding day. They avoided each other, Unable to confront the growing distance between them, Eleanor, feeling utterly isolated, found herself questioning whether she could ever truly be a part of Adrian's world. She felt like she had already lost herself, her identity tangled in a web of expectations she hadn't been able to meet. Was she just a role she played in his life? Did she have room to be her own person, to exist outside of the perfect image Adrian had painted for their life together? The questions gnawed at her, and the fear of losing herself completely consumed her. Adrian, on the other hand, was tormented by self-blame. He knew he had made a mistake. His obsession with controlling every aspect of their life had only pushed Eleanor further away. The echo of broken promises and unmet emotional needs weighed heavily on him. He thought that by ensuring everything was perfect, he could give Eleanor the life she deserved, but in reality, he had created a life that lacked the emotional intimacy they both needed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his obsession with perfection had kept him from truly seeing her, from understanding her fears and desires. Eleanor spent long nights alone, her mind wrestling with the chaos of the wedding and the love that once felt so simple but now seemed so complicated. She confronted her deepest fears, realizing that her struggles with love went beyond the pain of their marriage. She wasn't just afraid of love. She was terrified of the vulnerability it demanded. The thought of giving herself completely to another person, of surrendering her independence, felt like a loss of everything she had worked so hard to build. She had spent so many years protecting herself from the world, from relationships, and now, faced with the truth of her marriage, she wondered if she had made the right choice. Was love worth the risk of losing herself? Could she find a way to embrace vulnerability without falling apart? These questions haunted her, and every answer seemed to come with a new layer of doubt. For Adrian, the days were no less difficult. He withdrew from the spotlight, stepping back from the pressures of his empire and taking time to reflect on everything that had gone wrong. He had spent so much of his life controlling every aspect of his world, from business to relationships, and now he realized that his attempts to control Eleanor and their future had been a grave mistake. He had wanted to create a perfect life for her, but he had failed to realize that perfection wasn't what she needed. What she needed was emotional intimacy, space to grow, and a partner who saw her for who she truly was, not just as an extension of his ideal life. Adrian spent hours reflecting on his own fears, on his need to be in control, and on the painful truth that no amount of wealth or success could ever replace the emotional connection he had neglected in their relationship. The walls he had built around himself, meant to protect him from vulnerability, had also kept him from connecting with the woman he loved. Both Adrian and Eleanor found themselves facing uncomfortable truths, but those truths would prove to be pivotal. For Adrian, the realization was humbling. He couldn't buy love, he couldn't control it, and he couldn't force it to fit into a mold that he had created. Love required openness, honesty, and the willingness to accept the imperfections in both himself and Eleanor. He understood now that his need for perfection had come at the expense of their connection, and he wondered if it was too late to fix what he had broken. For Eleanor, the process was equally painful. She had always guarded her heart, unwilling to risk the pain of losing herself in someone else. But now, she recognized that her fear of vulnerability had prevented her from fully embracing love. She had kept Adrian at arm's length, unwilling to let him see the parts of herself that were messy, imperfect, and fragile. And in doing so, she had closed herself off to the love he was offering. Both of them had failed to give each other what they needed most, emotional intimacy and trust. And now, in the aftermath of their wedding, they were left with the daunting task of figuring out how to rebuild what had been lost. In the midst of this emotional upheaval, Eleanor rediscovered her art. She had always found solace in creativity, in the ability to express herself in ways words could not capture. As she returned to her painting, her sketches, her writing, she began to reconnect with the woman she had been before Adrian had entered her life. For so long, she had put her art aside, prioritizing Adrian's world, his expectations, But now she realized that her creativity was a vital part of who she was. It gave her strength. It allowed her to reclaim her independence. And in doing so, she began to trust her instincts again. Slowly, she started to carve out a space for herself outside of the identity she had adopted as Adrian's wife. She found joy in her art once more, and with it, she found a renewed sense of self-worth. Adrian, too, embarked on a journey of introspection. He took a step back from the pressures of his business empire, removing himself from the constant pursuit of wealth and success. He began to evaluate what he truly wanted from love, and more importantly, what he could offer in return. He realized that his controlling nature had prevented him from experiencing the kind of emotional depth he desired. True love, he now understood, required vulnerability, compromise, and the willingness to let go of control. He began to dismantle the walls he had built around himself, working on his emotional maturity and recognizing the importance of partnership and mutual respect. He understood now that love wasn't about perfection. It was about growth, about learning to navigate the messiness of life together, flaws and all. Despite their separation, a faint glimmer of hope began to emerge. Both Adrian and Eleanor slowly started to heal, each in their own way. The process was slow, and the road ahead was uncertain, but there was a subtle shift in their emotional states. They each began to recognize that self-love was an essential foundation for any relationship. Only by understanding and accepting themselves could they truly offer love to someone else. In their solitude, they found clarity. The question now was whether they could rebuild what they had lost, whether their love story could be redeemed, or if the damage done during their wedding day was irreparable. As time passed, both of them changed. Eleanor became more independent, more connected to herself, and Adrian became more emotionally aware, less focused on perfection, and more open to vulnerability. But whether their paths would converge again remained uncertain. The possibility of a new beginning hung in the air, like the fragile thread of a story yet to be written, as each of them stood on the precipice of healing with a choice to make: to let go of the past and move forward, either together or apart. After months of emotional distance and unspoken pain, Adrian and Eleanor found themselves face to face once again. The moment was thick with anticipation and uncertainty, as neither of them knew what to expect. Their initial interaction was filled with awkward silences and lingering emotions, both of them unsure of how to bridge the gap that had formed between them. It was as though they were both standing on fragile ground, hesitant but yearning for the chance to heal the past. Adrian, his heart heavy with regret and self-reflection, was the first to speak. He had spent months confronting his own flaws, understanding how his need for control had caused so much harm, and now, in this moment, he was vulnerable in a way he had never allowed himself to be before. He acknowledged his mistakes, the ways in which his obsession with perfection had pushed Eleanor away, and with raw honesty, he apologized. He apologized not just for his actions, but for the emotional harm he had caused to her sense of self and to their relationship. He admitted, finally, that he had been wrong to try to force their love into an idealized vision, one that had never truly considered Eleanor's needs and desires. He asked for her forgiveness, not expecting it, but hoping for the chance to rebuild what they had lost. Eleanor listened intently, her own emotions a mix of vulnerability and strength. She could hear the sincerity in Adrian's voice, and for a moment, she allowed herself to soften, recognizing the man before her had grown, had learned from his mistakes. But she also knew that their healing could not simply be about words. It had to be about true understanding. She accepted his apology, but she made it clear that moving forward required more than just acknowledgement of past wrongs. It required a deeper, more honest understanding of each other's needs, fears, and desires. She, too, had her own faults to confront: her fear of love, her reluctance to open up, her tendency to withdraw from emotional intimacy. These were the walls she had built around her heart. She apologized for her own shortcomings, for the ways in which she had kept herself from fully embracing their connection. But she also expressed her hope that they could rebuild their bond on a foundation of understanding, of vulnerability, and of mutual respect. This was no longer about forcing a perfect life into being. It was about starting over and allowing their love to grow in its own way. Adrian and Eleanor made a pact to rebuild from the ground up. They both rejected the idea of a perfect life, realizing that their relationship had never been about perfection. It had been about real connection, and that was something they had neglected. The wedding dress, once a symbol of all the expectations they had failed to meet, now stood as a potent reminder of their struggles and the growth they had experienced. They began to redefine their relationship, not in terms of material wealth or external validation, but in terms of emotional honesty and compromise. The old expectations, the ones that had once seemed so important, began to fade as they turned toward a more honest vision of their future together. Letting go of the past wasn't easy, but both of them knew it was necessary. They acknowledged the weight of their past mistakes, the unmet expectations, the emotional baggage, the missteps, but they chose to release it. The past could no longer dictate their future. This was their chance to create something new, something that was entirely their own. Together, Adrian and Eleanor embraced the realization that love was not about grand gestures or flawless moments. It was about the small, everyday acts of understanding, of kindness, and of supporting each other through life's challenges. They talked openly about their commitment to vulnerability, understanding that their relationship would not be perfect, but that it could be real. The process of forgiveness wasn't instantaneous. It was a journey that would require patience, trust, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. But as they continued to talk, to listen, to share, their bond deepened. Forgiveness, they realized, wasn't about forgetting or excusing past mistakes. It was about healing, about learning to love one another despite those imperfections. They knew that their love would not always be easy, but it would be genuine. In the months that followed, Adrian and Eleanor found healing, not just within their relationship, but within themselves. They reached a place of mutual forgiveness, not just for the mistakes that had caused their separation, but for the fears and insecurities that had kept them apart for so long. Adrian understood that his desire for control had been rooted in fear, and Eleanor recognized that her fear of vulnerability had prevented her from truly trusting. But through their honesty, they had created a new space for their love to grow, one that was built on acceptance and openness. They no longer needed to be perfect for each other. They only needed to be real. Looking ahead, Adrian and Eleanor found a new sense of clarity. Their past, while painful, had become the foundation for a future they could now build together. They began to dream not of a life defined by luxury or grandeur, but of a life filled with shared experiences, quiet moments, and real connection. They knew that the road ahead would not always be easy, but they also knew that they were stronger for having faced their fears and worked through their struggles. Their love was no longer defined by external pressures or unrealistic ideals. It was defined by the simple, profound truth that they had chosen to face life together, with all its imperfections, hand in hand. As they took their first steps into this new chapter of their relationship, there was a quiet peace between them. They no longer sought to meet anyone else's expectations. They had found their own way forward. And in that peace, they found the strength to move ahead with confidence, knowing that the love they shared was enough to sustain them through whatever challenges might come their way. Their journey had not been easy, but it had brought them to a place of understanding, of mutual respect, and of love that was grounded, authentic, and full of hope. The future, while unwritten, was theirs to create, and they were ready to write the next chapter of their love story together.